You should make things difficult for your protagonist. But the first thing we tend to think of when we hear this is the antagonist. And that's not wrong. I mean, the antagonist should be a formidable opponent to your protagonist, and on paper should actually be stronger than your protagonist. I mean, you look at him and you're like, okay, the antagonist is going to win. But if the only obstacle you're creating for your protagonist is in the antagonist, you're not really doing it right, or at least I should say not completely right. So we're going to talk today about another way to make it more difficult for your protagonist, and that's to give them what's called an intimate opponent. And we're going to pull that apart today. Thank you so much for watching. Thank you for liking. If you find value, subscribe if you haven't done that. I really appreciate it. There's some links below that might be helpful to you. Be sure to check those out. Let's jump in. I know what I'm about to say is not the experience that all of you have had, but I have been fortunate, and I'm so thankful that I have had parents and a spouse that supports what I do creatively. They support my creative work. Now, that doesn't mean they always understand what I'm doing, because I just think differently. I look at things different. I put things together that other people don't necessarily see, and that's just how my brain works, and they have supported me in that my whole life, and I'm so very thankful for that. But I also know that that's not the case for a lot of writers, and that's not the case for everybody else in my life. And at times, even my parents or my spouse have said, I just don't understand what you're doing. That doesn't make sense to me. I don't understand why you're up at 1 o'clock in the morning writing. And I get it. And it's hard in some ways to understand. It's hard for non-creatives to understand how our brain works and the ways our brain works. What that does, though, is that gives you a real life experience. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because it gives you a real life experience you can tap into about an intimate opponent. An intimate opponent is somebody that you care about. And, you know, I care about my parents. I'm still thankful they're around. And I care about my spouse. I'm thankful she's around. We've been battling cancer. So I'm just so thankful that she's here. So I love that they are here, that they are participating and engaging with me in my life, even though they don't always agree. And sometimes they question what I'm doing. That's an intimate opponent. Somebody that you have a relationship with that questions what you're doing, that pushes you to do different things, that may disagree with how you're doing something or why you're doing something. So let's just kind of pull that apart, because one of the benefits of having an intimate opponent in your story is it helps create some additional conflict and some additional obstacles for your protagonist outside of the antagonist. So you don't always have to have your protagonist and antagonist going at it. You can have your protagonist with a buddy, and a protagonist with a spouse, and a protagonist with a coworker, and like all of these other types of conflict. That's what an intimate opponent is. So let's pull that apart. When it comes to story, an intimate opponent is always working at cross purposes with another character. So you can have intimate opponents for your antagonist and protagonist and supporting characters. Like, you can have intimate opponents all throughout your story. So it's not just with your protagonist. I'm just trying to focus on that, though, because it just kind of helps simplify some things today and helps us understand. So I've got my protagonist here, and I have an intimate opponent for that protagonist. That intimate opponent is just working at cross purposes. Now, their working may be intentional. It might be unintentional. It might be something that with really good motives, just like how a parent would with a child, right? So my parents may not always understand why I do what I do. They're wanting the best for me. So they're working at cross purposes with me, but they're doing it for the right motives. So it's nothing bad against them. It's just, we're just kind of butting heads here. And that's what intimate opponents do. More importantly, intimate opponents always make it worse, or at least more complicated, for your protagonist or for the character that they're against. So they're always going to make it worse. Always. It's always going to be more complicated. Now, the thing with an intimate opponent, though, is it's always based on relationship. So you're only going to have an intimate opponent with people that you care about, with people that are kind of close to you in your orbit. And if the protagonist fails to go along with the intimate opponent, it's going to impact their relationship. It might be a short-term impact, it might be a long-term impact, but there's going to be some negative impact to that relationship. Maybe we don't trust each other. Maybe we don't talk to each other for a little while. There's going to be some frustration. There might be some anger expressed. So there's going to be something that happens that damages that relationship. It might be for a little while, might be for a long while, but that's always going to happen. It's always a possibility of a result if your protagonist chooses to go against their intimate opponent. So let me give you a couple of examples here. So maybe you've got an employer and an employee relationship. The employer wants the employee to do something, and maybe it's off the books and kind of illegal. I mean, the off the books part the employee was fine with, and because we're friends outside of work, okay, I can help, but you want me to do this, it's illegal, I don't know if I want to do that. Well, now it's going to damage the relationship. Or maybe it's the reverse. Maybe the employer's wanting the employee to do something legal, and the employee's like, that's not going to work very well for our company. That's not how we've been doing business. That's not how we stay afloat, and that may cause some tension. Or maybe you have two spouses, and they have different priorities. One of them priority is family first. The other one is we got to stay financially solvent. Okay, there's going to be some conflict there because one of them is going to want to do something that's going to go against what the other one thinks is the priority. Or what if you've got two spies? Okay, so like full on story, we've got two spies. They're doing something. They've got to like stop the villain. And one of them really believes in stopping the villain. The other one really believes in helping people and not letting there be any victims. But you can't do both. So we got to choose. Which one are we going to choose? Are we going to stop the villain, or are we going to protect the people? Now, whatever happens, there's going to be a result of some conflict between these two characters because they're intimate opponents. There's going to be some relationship fallout. And this is probably one of the things that you just need to keep in mind. Whenever you include an intimate opponent, whenever the character chooses to go against the intimate opponent, there needs to be some kind of relational fallout. We need to see that moment of relational fallout. Now, it might just be a very short visual. It might be somebody getting kicked out of an apartment or walking out of the office building holding the box with all their stuff. Like, it could just be very short, but there needs to be some negative impact to that relationship that we see, because there's got to be a consequence to your protagonist when they go against their intimate opponent. The other ways intimate opponents can disagree with your protagonist might be because of the how the protagonist is wanting to do something. So the protagonist wants to do it this way. The intimate opponent says, no, we should do it this other way. They're both in agreement that the thing should be done. It's the how it gets done that's creating the conflict, right? It's an intimate opponent. Another thing might be the reasoning behind why we're doing the thing. The protagonist wants to do a thing because of this reason. The intimate opponent wants to do it for this other reason. There's a difference in fundamental opinion about why the thing should be done. And that alone causes the conflict. Again, when you create conflict with an intimate opponent, we should see a relationship fallout element a little bit later. Not necessarily then, it can be much later, but we need to see that so that it pays off, because there's going to be a cost to the relationship when they disagree with how to do something or why something should be done. Now, this one with the how or the why tends to happen between two characters that might have different religious or moral beliefs. So this one believes this one believes this. Drop them in something. This one wants to do it for this reason. This one wants to do it for this other reason. And there's going to be some conflict there. Now, again, they might get it resolved because they're wanting to do the same thing, but there's going to be some conflict along the way. There's going to be a cost to their relationship. You might also have two coworkers doing something, but the boss has given one of them a directive to do this thing and another one a directive to do this other thing. And they show up and they're doing the thing, and they're wondering why the other one is doing something that seems at cross purposes. Okay, the reasoning behind what they're doing and how they're supposed to accomplish something, they're both kind of following orders, but it's gonna cause problems for that relationship, even though they didn't necessarily inflict that problem on themselves. Somebody else did. So you can have other people interject problems in relationships. Of course you can, right? So, but this is kind of how you can conceptualize and how do I orchestrate this in a story. Another example of this would be any child or employee who doesn't understand the actions of the parent or the supervisor. So the child is doing this thing, but the parent is saying, well, but you need to do this other thing. And there's going to be some conflict there. That's intimate opponent, right? Or an employee a boss. So the employee's like, well, we've always kind of done it this way. And the boss saying, well, but now I kind of think you should do it this other way. Okay, that's going to create some friction. It's going to create a problem. Now, sometimes that can be resolved, right? Sometimes these are resolved kind of in the moment if it's a little thing, right? We're going to have a discussion and that's the cost, right? We're going to waste some time, or one of them is going to have to apologize or give a little bit when they don't really like doing that, but we're going to do it so we can resolve it so we can move forward. So sometimes that's the cost. Sometimes it's much bigger than that and happens a lot later. Sometimes there's a much bigger fallout, right? Someone rebels, somebody acts out, somebody does something that the other person is a recipient of, and they don't really understand what's going on. And a lot of times it's just we're not understanding the communication, and that's what happens in real life, but that's also what happens in stories. So if you can think about it as like an intimate opponent and think about the reasoning why or understanding why or how to do something, it really helps you kind of articulate the nature of the relationship between the intimate opponent and the protagonist, or again, any other character. So let me give you a few tips for including intimate opponents, because hopefully by now you're like, hey, you know what? This happens in real life all the time. This would help my story. I need to make sure I have them. So how do I make sure I have intimate opponents in my story? So let me give you a few tips for that. Tip number one, you need to make sure that your main character cares about some other character in the story. Okay, if your main character or whoever you're trying to create an intimate opponent for doesn't care about anybody else, no intimate opponent. Intimate opponents are there because of relationships. There's got to be a relationship. Now, the relationship can start in the movie. Like we can see two people meet, and they start to care about each other, and they can be kind of intimate opponents along the way. That can totally happen. Or they can have a long-standing relationship. We show up in the movie or the TV show, whatever it is, and they've got history, and they've already got some things going on. Like either one is fine, but there's got to be somebody that the main character or whoever you're giving an intimate opponent to that they care about in the story. If they don't care about anybody else, it's going to be a problem creating an intimate opponent. Now, you can orchestrate this, so you can give them coworkers or fellow soldiers or whatever it is, right? So you can kind of orchestrate that, but there still has to be some kind of fundamental relationship. There's still got to be some level of care and concern from both characters toward one another. And without that, you're not really going to be successful incorporating intimate opponent stuff. So that's probably step number one. Make sure there's somebody else that the main character, whoever you're trying to give an intimate opponent to, that they care about. Two, and I've mentioned this, so this one's just going to be quick. You can have intimate opponents for other characters. It doesn't just have to be for your protagonist. I mean, your antagonist might have a loyal henchman or something like that disagrees with the antagonist at a key moment. And how are they going to resolve that? Is the antagonist just going to outright kill him? Are they going to fire him right off the bat? And then the henchman comes and works for the good guy. Like, you can create all kinds of things. It creates lots of unpredictable moments, lots of surprises, all that kind of stuff, just because of the conflict as a result of intimate opponents. So don't just think you can only give them to your protagonist. You can give them to any other character. There just has to be a relationship between the two, and there's going to be a cost when one of them disagrees with the other. So just make sure that it's clear that you have that moment showing what the cost was. And the cost thing, that's number three. There's got to be a consequence. So make sure we see that. Make sure we have a consequence. I've touched on that already, so I'm just kind of moving on to the next one. The next tip, whoever is being pressured by the intimate opponent must be able to change. Not necessarily willing, but able. Okay, they're capable of changing. They're able to change their mind. They may not want to, and they may decide not to, but they are able to. Like, we need to make sure that the protagonist or whoever has the choice to do what the intimate opponent is asking or not. If they do it, okay, great. So they've got to be willing to change to be able to do that. If they don't do it, then there's got to be a consequence, which we've talked about. Now realize protagonists often can change and usually do, not always, okay? Just keep in mind, they tend to be more flexible. Antagonists tend to not. So if somebody questions the antagonist, usually they don't really change. There's a falling out. There's a consequence for their henchman or whoever it was. It causes a problem. So just realize antagonists are usually just such driving forces and protagonists that, you know, the antagonist is not going to change. The protagonist might change, and it might be that willingness to change is what helps them overcome the antagonist ultimately anyway. So sometimes you want your protagonist to be able to do that, but they have to be able to change. Not necessarily willing, but able. Before I give you the last tip, if you've found value at all, please be sure to interact in some way. Hitting the like button is super easy. Just hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't, all that stuff, comment below, whatever. So just interact in some way. I really appreciate it. YouTube really loves it and it helps other people find the channel. So thank you for doing that. Last tip I want to give you about intimate opponents is intimate opponents are the Achilles heel to whatever character they're the opponent of. So if I have a protagonist who has an intimate opponent, if the antagonist gets to that intimate opponent to blackmail them, capture them, hurt them, kill them, whatever, that's an Achilles heel to the protagonist. Okay, so the other way that intimate opponents are helpful is because it helps to tighten the screws and raise the stakes on different characters. So if the protagonist gets to the intimate opponent of the antagonist, well, now that also raises stakes. So just keep in mind the intimate opponent is the Achilles heel to whoever they are opposing from the real opposition. Hopefully you're able to track all those opposition things, and hopefully that makes sense. I see it in my head. I hope I'm explaining it. So you've got protagonist, intimate opponent, antagonist. If they get to this person, ooh, that's bad for them. So hopefully that makes sense. So if you've got an intimate opponent, don't be afraid to do that. Use them as an Achilles heel weapon against your protagonist to make things worse. Hopefully this has been helpful to you. If it has, please be sure to like, subscribe, bell. I really appreciate it. Thank you for watching. When you go to tell a story, whether you include an intimate opponent or not, but you should because they're really good, tell a story that matters. See you later.